New York in 1805. A complete documentary. Chapter 1. The Political Landscape and Governance of Early New York. The year 1805 marked a pivotal moment in the young history of New York City. The United States itself was barely 3 decades old, having declared independence from the British rule just 29 years earlier. The nation was still finding its footing, establishing its identity, and New York City stood at the very heart of this great American experiment. Thomas Jefferson occupied the presidency during this time, serving his second term in office. The Democratic-Republican Party held considerable power, and the political landscape of New York reflected the broader tensions and ambitions of the fledgling nation. The city had served as the nation's capital from 1785 to 1790. And though the seat of government had moved first to Philadelphia and then to the newly constructed Washington, D.C., New York, remained an essential political hub. The shadow of one of the most dramatic political events in American history hung heavily over the city in 1805. Just 1 year earlier, in July 1804, Aaron Burr, the sitting vice president of the United States, had fatally shot Alexander Hamilton in a duel across the Hudson River in Weehawken, New Jersey. Hamilton, the brilliant architect of America's financial system and a prominent New York resident, died the following day from his wounds. His death sent shockwaves through the city and the nation, leaving a void in New York's political establishment that would take years to fill. Aaron Burr, once a powerful figure in New York politics, found himself a fugitive after the duel. Though he returned briefly to complete his term as vice president, his political career lay in ruins. The scandal and controversy surrounding Hamilton's death divided New York society and intensified political rivalries that had been simmering for years. In terms of local governance, New York City operated under a system that concentrated power in the hands of a relatively small group of property-owning citizens. The Common Council governed the city's affairs, consisting of aldermen and assistant aldermen elected from the various wards. These officials made decisions regarding public works, markets, licensing, and the general welfare of the city's inhabitants. DeWitt Clinton emerged as one of the most influential political figures in New York during this period. Serving in various capacities, including as a United States Senator and later as mayor, Clinton represented the ambitious, forward-thinking spirit that would come to define New York's trajectory in the 19th century. His vision for the city extended beyond mere governance. He dreamed of connecting New York to the interior of the continent through an ambitious canal project that would later become the Erie Canal. Voting rights in 1805 remained restricted to white men who met certain property qualifications. Women, enslaved people, and most free black men were excluded from the political process. The democratic ideals proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence had yet to be fully realized, and New York's political system reflected the contradictions and limitations of the era. The court system in New York handled a variety of civil and criminal matters. Judges presided over cases ranging from property disputes to serious crimes. The legal profession was growing, with lawyers playing increasingly important roles in both business and political affairs. The influence of English common law remained strong, though American jurisprudence was beginning to develop its own distinct character. Political discourse in 1805 occurred through newspapers, public gatherings, and the taverns that served as informal meeting places for citizens of all classes. Partisan newspapers fiercely championed their respective causes, often engaging in personal attacks and sensationalism that would seem familiar to modern observers. The freedom of the press, guaranteed by the First Amendment, allowed for vigorous debate and the free exchange of ideas, even when that exchange became contentious. Chapter 2. The Streets and Architecture of Early Manhattan. Walking through New York City in 1805 would have been a vastly different experience from navigating the modern metropolis. the city occupied only the southernmost tip of Manhattan Island, extending roughly 2 miles from the Battery to what is now City Hall Park. Beyond this developed area lay farmland, estates, and open countryside, stretching northward toward distant villages like Greenwich, Harlem, and Manhattanville. The street layout of Lower Manhattan in 1805 followed a somewhat haphazard pattern, reflecting the city's Dutch origins and organic growth over the previous centuries. Narrow, winding streets characterized the oldest sections near the waterfront, their irregular courses dictated by geography and the sea and the gradual accumulation of development rather than any grand urban plan. Pearl Street, once fronting the East River shoreline, had been left inland as landfill projects expanded the city's footprint into the water. Broadway served as the city's main thoroughfare, running northward from the Bowling Green at the tip of Manhattan. This wide avenue accommodated the majority of the city's through traffic, with elegant residences, shops, and public buildings lining its course. Walking along Broadway, one would encounter a mix of architectural styles reflecting the city's Dutch heritage, British colonial period, and the emerging federal style that characterized American building in the early Republic. The streets themselves presented significant challenges to pedestrians and vehicles alike. Unpaved for the most part, they turned to mud during rainstorms and generated clouds of dust during dry weather. Cobblestone paving existed in some areas, but it was far from universal. Wooden planks served as sidewalks in many locations, though these too varied greatly in quality and maintenance. Street lighting remained primitive by modern standards. Oil lamps mounted on posts provided some illumination after dark, but their light was feeble and irregular. Many streets remained entirely dark at night, making evening travel hazardous and contributing to the city's reputation for crime and disorder after sunset. Buildings in 1805 New York displayed considerable variety in construction and style. Wooden structures predominated, particularly in older neighborhoods and among the homes of ordinary citizens. Fire represented a constant danger in a city built largely of timber, and devastating conflagrations had repeatedly swept through sections of the city in previous decades. Efforts to require brick or stone construction met with limited success, as the expense of such materials remained beyond the means of many property owners. Wealthier residents and important public buildings increasingly featured federal-style architecture, characterized by symmetry, classical proportions, and refined decorative elements. Red brick facades with white trim, arched windows, and elegant doorways marked the homes of the prosperous merchant class. These substantial dwellings often included gardens and outbuildings, creating private oases amid the bustle of the growing city. One of the most significant architectural projects underway in 1805 was the construction of a new city hall. The old City Hall, located at the corner of Wall and Nassau Streets, had become inadequate for the needs of the expanding municipality. The new building, designed by architects Joseph-François Mangin and John Macomb Jr., would take several more years to complete, finally opening in 1812. Its elegant French Renaissance and American federal design would establish it as one of the finest public buildings in the young nation. Churches represented another important category of architecture in early New York. Trinity Church, at the head of Wall Street, stood as one of the city's most prominent landmarks, though the building that exists today would not be constructed until later into the century. St. Paul's Chapel, completed in 1766, remains standing to this day and provides a tangible connection to the New York of 1805. Its Georgian architecture and churchyard offered a space for reflection amid the commercial bustle of Lower Manhattan. Chapter 3. Commerce, Trade, and the Bustling Harbor. The economic vitality of New York in 1805 derived primarily from its magnificent natural harbor and its strategic position as a gateway to the American interior. The waterfront teemed with activity from dawn to dusk, as ships from distant ports discharged their cargoes and took on American goods for the return voyage. Merchants, sailors, dock workers, and traders of every description contributed to a commercial energy that was already establishing New York as the premier trading city of the new nation. The port handled an astonishing variety of goods. Ships arriving from Europe brought manufactured items that American industry could not yet produce in sufficient quantity or quality. Fine textiles, ceramics, glassware, metalwork, and luxury goods for the wealthy. From the Caribbean came sugar, molasses, coffee, and rum, products of the plantation economies that depended on enslaved labor. Coastal vessels connected New York to other American ports, facilitating the exchange of regional products throughout the young nation. American exports reflected the agricultural and resource-based economy of the early republic. Flour and grain from the farms of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania moved through the port in vast quantities. Timber, furs, and other raw materials found ready markets in Europe. The products of America's growing merchant fleet contributed to an increasingly favorable balance of trade. Wall Street was already emerging as the center of American finance, though its role would expand dramatically in the coming decades. The Bank of New York, founded by Alexander Hamilton in 1784, continued to operate as one for the city's most important financial institutions. Banks provided essential services for merchants, offering credit, facilitating transactions, and providing a secure place for the storage of valuable assets. The New York Stock Exchange, though not yet formalized under that name, had its origins in the trading activities that took place along Wall Street. Brokers and traders gathered to buy and sell securities, particularly government bonds and bank shares. The famous Buttonwood Agreement of 1792, in which 24 stockbrokers agreed to trade only among themselves and to charge fixed commissions, had established the framework for organized securities trading in the city. Insurance companies played a vital role in the commercial life of the port. Maritime insurance allowed merchants and ship owners to manage the considerable risks of ocean voyages, when storms, pirates, and navigation errors could result in the total loss of vessels and cargoes worth fortunes. Insurance also covered fires, which posed a constant threat to warehouses and commercial establishments. The merchant class occupied the highest echelon of New York's economic hierarchy. Successful traders accumulated substantial wealth, building elegant homes, supporting cultural institutions, and wielding considerable political influence. Many merchants maintained close ties with their European counterparts, traveling across the Atlantic periodically and keeping abreast of developments in overseas markets. Below the merchants in the economic hierarchy stood a diverse array of skilled tradesmen and craftsmen. Shipbuilders, rope makers, sail makers, and coopers produced the essential equipment for the maritime trade. Blacksmiths, carpenters, tailors, shoemakers, and practitioners of dozens of other trades served the needs of the city's growing population. These artisans typically operated small workshops, employing apprentices and journeymen in the traditional manner of European craft production. Retail trade concentrated in the markets and shops that served the daily needs of New Yorkers. The public markets provided spaces for farmers and vendors to sell fresh produce, meat, fish, and other foodstuffs. Shopkeepers offered dry goods, hardware, medicines, and countless other items. Street vendors and peddlers supplemented these fixed establishments, carrying their wares through the neighborhoods and crying their offers to passers-by. The economic life of New York in 1805 was not without its challenges. International tensions, particularly with Britain and France, periodically disrupted trade patterns. The Napoleonic Wars raging in Europe created both opportunities and dangers for American merchants. Impressment of American sailors by the British Navy and restrictions on neutral trade caused considerable resentment and would eventually contribute to the War of 1812. Chapter 4. Daily Life. How New Yorkers lived, worked, and played. The rhythms of daily life in 1805 New York differed dramatically from the patterns familiar to modern city dwellers. Without electricity, running water, or modern transportation, the basics of existence required constant effort and ingenuity. Yet New Yorkers of this era created a vibrant urban culture that laid the foundations for the great metropolis that would emerge in later decades. The day began early for most New Yorkers. Sunrise brought the resumption of activity after the relative quiet of the night. Servants in wealthy households kindled fires in hearths and stoves, preparing the home for the family's awakening. Working people rose to begin their labors, knowing that daylight was a precious resource not to be wasted. The streets gradually filled with the sounds of commerce, the clip-clop of horses' hooves, the rumble of cart wheels, and the voices of vendors announcing their wares. Housing conditions varied enormously depending on one's economic status. Wealthy families occupied spacious homes with multiple rooms, separate kitchens, and private gardens. Their houses featured the finest materials and craftsmanship available, with imported furnishings and decorative elements that proclaimed their owners' taste and prosperity. Servants, often enslaved or indentured, handled the numerous tasks required to maintain such establishments. Middle-class families lived more modestly, but still enjoyed reasonable comfort by the standards of the era. A typical household might occupy a 2- or 3-story brick or wooden home, with family living quarters above a ground-floor shop or workspace. Space was at a premium, and multiple generations often shared the same roof. Privacy as we understand it today was a luxury that few could afford. The poor and working classes crowded into cramped quarters in the less desirable sections of the city. Boarding houses, tenements, and shared rooms accommodated laborers, immigrants, and those struggling to survive in the urban economy. Sanitary conditions in these dwellings left much to be desired, contributing to the disease outbreaks that periodically swept through the city. Water supply represented one of the most significant challenges facing New Yorkers in 1805. The city lacked a municipal water system, and residents relied on wells, springs, and the T-water pump, a famous spring near what is now City Hall. Water quality varied considerably, and contaminated supplies contributed to illness and disease. Vendors sold water from carts, serving those without convenient access to wells. The need for a reliable, clean water supply was already recognized, though it would take decades before the Croton Aqueduct brought abundant fresh water to the city. Sanitation posed equally serious challenges. Indoor plumbing did not exist. Instead, residents used chamber pots and outhouses. Human waste accumulated in cesspools, or was dumped into the streets and waterways. Animal waste from the horses that provided the city's transportation added to the problem. The smells of early 19th century New York would be overwhelming to modern sensibilities. Food came primarily from the public markets that operated on designated days throughout the week. The Fly Market, Oswego Market, and other establishments offered fresh produce, meat, fish, and provisions of all kinds. Housewives or their servants rose early to secure the best selections before the choicest items sold out. Cooking took place over open hearths or in cast-iron stoves, requiring skill and constant attention. Preservation of food depended on salting, smoking, pickling, and other traditional methods, as refrigeration lay decades in the future. Clothing styles in 1805 reflected both fashion trends and practical necessities. Men of the upper classes wore tailored coats with high collars, waistcoats, and knee breeches, or the newly fashionable long trousers. Women's fashion featured high-waisted empire-style dresses inspired by classical Greek and Roman models. Working people dressed more simply, in sturdy garments suited to their labors. Textiles remained expensive, and most people owned far fewer items of clothing than modern consumers might possess. Entertainment and recreation took many forms in early New York. Taverns served as social centers where men gathered to drink, discuss politics, conduct business, and enjoy each other's company. These establishments ranged from respectable gathering places for merchants and professionals to rough dives catering to sailors and laborers. The theater attracted audiences eager for drama, comedy, and musical performances. The Park Theater, opened in 1798, presented productions that rivaled those of European capitals. Chapter 5. Society, Culture, and the People of New York. The population of New York City in 1805 stood at approximately 75,000 to 80,000 inhabitants, making it the largest city in the United States and one of the largest in the Americas. This diverse population included people of many backgrounds, origins, and circumstances, creating a complex social fabric that both reflected and contributed to the city's dynamic character. The social hierarchy of early New York was clearly defined, though not entirely rigid. At the apex stood the great merchant families and landowners, whose wealth derived from trade, finance, and real estate. Names like Livingston, Van Rensselaer, and Schuyler carried weight in both business and political circles. These families intermarried, attended the same churches, belonged to the same clubs, and exercised disproportionate influence over the city's affairs. The professional class occupied the next tier of society. Lawyers, physicians, clergymen, and educators enjoyed respectable status, though their incomes and influence varied considerably. The legal profession was growing in importance as commerce generated an increasing volume of contracts, disputes, and transactions requiring professional expertise. Medicine remained relatively primitive by modern standards, but physicians commanded respect, even when their treatments proved ineffective. Artisans and skilled tradespeople formed the backbone of the urban economy. Master craftsmen who owned their own shops and employed workers enjoyed a measure of independence and respectability. Journeymen, who had completed their apprenticeships but did not own establishments, worked for wages while hoping to eventually establish their own businesses. Apprentices, often teenagers, learned their trades while providing cheap labor for their masters. Below the artisan class stood a large population of unskilled laborers, servants, and workers of various kinds. Dock workers loaded and unloaded ships. Domestic servants maintained the homes of the wealthy. Day laborers performed whatever tasks they could find, their employment irregular and their incomes uncertain. This population included both free workers and those bound by various forms of unfree labor. Slavery remained legal in New York in 1805, though the institution was in decline. The Gradual Emancipation Act of 1799 had decreed that children born to enslaved mothers after July 4th of that year would become free, though only after lengthy periods of indentured servitude. Adult slaves were not freed by this law, and thousands of African Americans remained in bondage throughout the state. The total abolition of slavery in New York would not occur until 1827. Free black New Yorkers constituted a significant community within the city. As though facing discrimination and limited opportunities, they established churches, schools, and mutual aid societies. The African Free School, founded in 1787, provided education for black children. Free blacks worked in various trades, though they often faced exclusion from the more lucrative occupations. Their communities developed distinct cultural traditions that would enrich the broader American experience. Immigration contributed to the diversity of New York's population. Though the great waves of immigration that would transform the city lay decades in the future, newcomers from Europe and elsewhere arrived regularly at the port. Irish immigrants, fleeing poverty and oppression in their homeland, began establishing a presence that would grow dramatically in coming decades. Germans, French, and others added their contributions to the urban mix. Religious life in New York reflected this diversity. The Dutch Reformed Church, an inheritance from the colonial period, maintained numerous congregations. The Episcopal Church, successor to the Church of England, counted many of the city's elite among its members. Presbyterians, Methodists, Baptists, and members of other Protestant denominations worshipped in their respective churches. The small but significant Catholic community gathered at St. Peter's Church, the city's first Catholic parish, established in 1785. Jews had been present in New York since the 17th century, when a group of Sephardic refugees from Brazil established themselves in the Dutch colony. Congregation Shearith Israel, founded in 1654, served the Jewish community and remains the oldest Jewish congregation in North America. Though small in number, Jewish New Yorkers contributed to the commercial and cultural life of the city. Education in 1805 New York served primarily the children of the affluent. Private academies and tutors provided instruction for those who could afford the fees. Columbia College, founded in 1754 as King's College, educated young men for careers in law, medicine, the ministry, and other professions. The charity school movement was beginning to address the needs of poor children, though universal public education remained far in the future. Chapter 6: Challenges, Changes, and the Dawn of a New Era. New York in 1805 faced numerous challenges that would shape its development in the years to come. Disease, poverty, crime, and the limitations of urban infrastructure tested the resilience of the city's inhabitants and institutions. Yet within these challenges lay the seeds of transformation that would ultimately establish New York as the preeminent American city. Yellow fever represented the most terrifying public health threat of the era. Periodic epidemics swept through the city during the warm summer months, killing hundreds and driving those who could afford to flee into the countryside. The cause of the disease remained unknown, though theories abounded. Some blamed the filth and miasma of the waterfront districts. Others attributed the outbreaks to ships arriving from tropical ports. The true cause, transmission by mosquitoes, would not be understood for another century. Other diseases also took their toll on the population. Smallpox, typhus, dysentery, and various childhood illnesses contributed to mortality rates far higher than those of modern developed nations. Life expectancy was significantly shorter than today, and infant mortality claimed a heartbreaking proportion of children before their first birthdays. Medical knowledge and treatment options remained limited, though vaccination against smallpox was beginning to offer hope for preventing that particular scourge. Poverty presented persistent challenges in a city where wealth and deprivation existed in close proximity. The almshouse provided shelter and sustenance for the most desperate, but conditions within were harsh, and residents were expected to work in exchange for their keep. Private charity, often organized through churches and benevolent societies, supplemented public relief efforts. The workhouse confined those convicted of minor offenses, providing a hybrid of punishment and poor relief. Crime and disorder troubled the streets of early New York. The Night Watch, a force of citizens paid to patrol after dark, provided only limited protection against thieves, ruffians, and others who preyed upon the unwary. Taverns and grog shops sometimes became scenes of violence, particularly in the rougher waterfront neighborhoods. The prison system aimed to punish and reform offenders, though conditions within were often brutal. Fire remained a constant threat to the largely wooden city. Fire companies staffed by volunteers responded to alarms with hand-operated pumping engines and bucket brigades. Competition between companies sometimes impeded effective firefighting, as rivalries led to confrontations at fire scenes. Building regulations attempted to reduce fire risk, but enforcement was inconsistent, and devastating blazes periodically destroyed entire blocks. Despite these challenges, New York in 1805 stood on the threshold of remarkable growth and transformation. The city's population would more than double in the next 2 decades, straining existing infrastructure and demanding new solutions. The street grid plan adopted in 1811 would impose order on the island's future development, creating the framework for the expansion northward that would eventually fill Manhattan. The vision of a canal connecting the Hudson River to the Great Lakes, championed by DeWitt Clinton and others, would become reality with the completion of the Erie Canal in 1825. This waterway would cement New York's position as the nation's commercial center, channeling the products of the interior through its port and enriching its merchants beyond all previous imagining. Technological changes barely glimpsed in 1805 would transform every aspect of urban life. Steam power would revolutionize transportation and manufacturing. Gas lighting would illuminate the streets and extend the productive hours of the day. The telegraph would annihilate distance and communication. Each innovation would contribute to the acceleration of change that characterized the 19th century. The culture and institutions of 1805 New York laid foundations that would endure through all these transformations. The tradition of commercial enterprise, the diversity of population, the energy and ambition of the inhabitants, these characteristics would define New York through its subsequent development into the world's greatest city. Looking back from our present vantage point, we can appreciate both the differences and the continuities that connect us to New Yorkers of 1805. They faced challenges we cannot fully imagine, yet they also displayed resourcefulness, creativity, and determination that remain relevant today. Their city, for all its limitations and problems, contained the essential spirit that would make New York a beacon for millions of immigrants and a center of world commerce, culture, and innovation. The New York of 1805 was a city in transition, poised between its colonial past and its metropolitan future. Its streets echoed with the footsteps of people who could not fully envision what their city would become, yet who contributed daily to its becoming. Their lives, their labors, their dreams and disappointments are part of the great tapestry of human experience that makes history meaningful. In understanding how New York was in 1805, we gain insight not only into a particular moment in time, but into the processes of change and continuity that shape all human communities. Conclusion. The New York of 1805 was a young, vibrant, and rapidly evolving city standing at the crossroads of history. It was a place where the shadows of the American Revolution still lingered, where the death of Alexander Hamilton remained fresh in public memory, and where the foundations of American commerce and finance were being firmly established. With approximately 80,000 residents crowded into the southern tip of Manhattan, the city hummed with commercial activity, political intrigue, and the daily struggles of people from all walks of life. From the wealthy merchants in their elegant federal-style homes to the laborers crowding into cramped quarters near the docks, from the enslaved African Americans awaiting the full promise of freedom to the immigrants arriving with hopes for a new beginning, New York in 1805 represented the full complexity of the early American experience. The challenges were immense: disease, fire, crime, inadequate infrastructure, and the deep injustices of slavery and inequality. Yet the energy, ambition, and innovative spirit that would come to define New York were already evident in its bustling harbor, its growing financial sector, and its diverse, enterprising population. Understanding New York in 1805 helps us appreciate the remarkable transformation that would unfold over the following 2 centuries. The decisions made, the institutions built, and the character formed during this early period established patterns that continue to influence the city today. In the streets of 1805 New York, we can recognize the beginnings of the world's greatest metropolis.